This week on The Right Side, Canada abstains on a UN resolution against the United States, Victoria bans plastic bags despite better alternatives, and the Alberta NDP decide to let themselves borrow $5 billion more money. Also, we conclude the year-long investigation into Trudeau's lack of ethics. This is The Right Side, episode 48, recorded Saturday, December 23rd, 2017. The Borrowers. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for The Right Side. Here we are. Christmas Eve is upon us. Christmas Day. Merry Christmas to everyone listening to this episode of The Right Side. Welcome back, Patrick.
Hey, it's good to be back for our second to last show of the year in 2017. Who knew we would make it this far, right?
Indeed. And, you and I had a little bit of an internal discussion before we began, and, we decided, is there going to be news this week, or should we just do the year in review show this week? But lo and behold, we actually have some really substantive news this week. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do The Right Side as we normally do. But if you're joining us for the first time, The Right Side is a podcast that seeks to cut through the bias and sensationalism in the mainstream media and provide the other side of the story, or the side of the story that the mainstream media is just not providing with this. And, we have a whopper of a show coming next week on that front, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. But in the meantime, if you want to follow along with us on this episode, you can head on over to rightsidenews.ca where you can find our full show notes. So we're going to begin with something that Canada did this week that was a bit of a shock to our ally, the United States. It's generally considered that the United States is Canada's best ally and has been, ever since the conclusion of hostilities at the end of War of 1812 practically, and it's just got better ever since then. And we have the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, and that's something that both countries are really proud of. And, normally we have each other's backs, but not this week. So this week, Canada abstained from a vote at the UN, and this vote at the UN was against the United States, and in particular, President Donald Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The motion that was put forward to the UN would have declared the United States move and their intention to move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem relatively null and void. Now, this, of course, would be a symbolic move because the UN doesn't have control over where a sovereign country places its embassy. And it would have just been a way of saying, hey, the international community doesn't agree with you on this. The vote passed 128-9, though people at the UN were expecting it to be closer to 150. That didn't happen. 35 countries, including Canada, abstained. More on that in just a moment and to why that's actually important. Now, you might be wondering what countries actually voted yes with the United States, and those were Guatemala, Honduras, Israel, of course, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, and Togo. So those are, I think, in the most part, Pacific Island countries and Central American countries, with the exception of Israel, right? And it's interesting as to why these countries would support that. And I think it goes towards the makeup of those countries and the way they see Israel compared to the way the rest of the world sees Israel and what they want to say at the UN. I think that's a good way of putting the way that this vote fell down.
I think another way that you could describe it is those are a lot of those countries are very heavily propped up by the U.S. and in their foreign budgets and whatnot. A lot of their funding comes from the U.S.
Right.
Guatemala and Honduras, of course. A lot of their economy is driven by U.S.-based companies, and as for the Marshall Islands and a lot of the other islands that are there, a lot of them have very good ties to the United States as well.
That would be going back to World War II.
Exactly, and I think voting yes on those, they don't really see that there would be any downside to abstaining or voting no. They want to have a better, they want to have better ties to the United States anyways. So
yeah.
there's no point to them not voting for it.
And in this vote, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina, said that the U.S. would be watching and taking names with this vote as to who wouldn't be on the American side here. And of course, this is referring to the fact that, as you mentioned, Patrick, a good number of these countries do get their funding from the United States. So it kind of lets the U.S. know of aside from their core allies like Canada and the UK and France and the NATO countries, lets them know about the other countries in the world who really stands with the U.S. Now, you might be wondering, how does this matter to Canada, and why there's no actual specific purpose to this resolution? So we'll tackle this in two parts here. So this matters here because this is what the UN does at its whole today in 2017. The UN was founded after World War II, and its precursor, the League of Nations, after World War I. Their goal was to prevent anything like World War I or World War II from ever happening again in the world. And as the Cold War came about, and as the Cold War then ended, and in general hostilities in the world between major powers has decreased, the UN has shifted its role to a more humanitarian and almost nation-building aspect of funneling money to developing countries around the world. And that's what makes this vote really interesting, is because it is affect everyone at the UN, in this case versus the United States. And the presentation of this in the media is, though, that this is a major problem for the United States. But for anyone who voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 U.S. election, will see this as a major success, because the platform that Donald Trump ran on and won on was America First. And that's precisely what the U.S. is doing in that move to Jerusalem, and why they don't really care about the outcome of this vote. And there's also the other side of it, in that there has been a horrid misrepresentation in the media of the whole embassy move to Jerusalem. Everyone is outright saying that the U.S. is now declaring Jerusalem the capital of Israel. But it was back in 1948 when the State of Israel was founded by UN resolution that stated that that should be the capital of Israel, Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the political capital of Israel. The Knesset is there, which is the Israeli parliament, and that is where the Israeli prime minister also lives. So the media is really shifting people towards a big misrepresentation of what's going on with this story, because Jerusalem is already the political capital of Israel. The only decision that was made was for the U.S. to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And, it's just baffling as to why that is being reported that way in the media, when that's already the case. It should be that the U.S. is moving its embassy there, not that the capital is being changed in recognition.
Yeah, it's almost like the news agencies are trying to prey on people that are reading it, and if they don't have the knowledge already that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, they're going to think when they read that article, oh, well, it looks like the U.S. is, meddling in the Middle East. I wonder how this will affect things over there. And when really they're just moving their embassy from one city to another. And I mean, in the large part, I don't think that'll have that big of an outcome on it. I mean, sure, there were some protests and whatnot, but nothing more than what we would see from other protests in other places around the world as well.
And there's definitely more death in the Middle East on a day-to-day basis than there was at all in these protests. So misrepresentation there. Now back to Canada and why this is important for us. Spokesman Adam Austin for Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland said, "We are disappointed that this resolution is one-sided and does not advance prospects for peace to which we aspire, and which is why we have abstained on today's vote." So now you might be asking, why did Canada vote this way? Why did Canada abstain? And why are we taking this neutral road approach? rather than standing with our ally, the United States. Well, we ultimately chose to appear neutral because it is no secret that the Trudeau government has its eye on one of the temporary UN Security Council seats that will come up in 2020. These seats are allocated based on a number of criteria, and they're geographically allocated with this. One for Africa, one for the Asia-Pacific region, one for Latin America and the Caribbean, and two for Western European and the others groups. And we, of course, in this case, fall into the others groups and will be contesting the seat in 2020. Now, with that, we need to ask ourselves, okay, what does a UN Security Council seat get us, and let alone a temporary one? Well, I think we have established at this point that what the UN does today in the modern world is largely symbolic, in that there is no central power with the United Nations, and the true power rests with other alliances like NATO and whatnot. So it's a question as to if this is something that Canada can afford for its foreign policy, given our current state of negotiations with the United States and the NAFTA deal, for example. Do we want to take this step back when we need to be closer to the US for NAFTA? That's another big question with this. And ultimately, at the end of the day, is taking this stance worth it when it's not really something that has been in Canada's domain to have a major role on UN stages like this before, when, of course, we can have a major role without the UN. So it's a question of, do we want to put our own domestic trade deals with the United States on the line for this symbolic vote at the UN, where we could potentially run for the Security Council seat? So we can see here what the priority is, I think, of the Canadian government. And as we talked about last week, NAFTA is huge, and that is something that we need to go forward.
Exactly, and this is something that is going to dominate quite a bit of the news cycle in the first part of the year, once Parliament resumes again. And that's something that they're going to have to really work on, is to try and kind of repair this relationship with the United States over this, and to try and get a way so that they can get a good trade deal out of NAFTA. And if not through NAFTA, then through a different mean. And Donald Trump, in a lot of his speeches, he says that he's good friends with Trudeau, and that he thinks he's a good guy, but that they disagree on a lot of different things. So who knows what he actually thinks, of course. But this is something that they're going to have to be focused on, and I think that when the media tries to kind of spin the news to come at it from a different angle from what is actually being taken, like with the move to Jerusalem for the embassy, I think that's something that the news agencies really should be getting to the bottom of this and seeing what the actual impact is going to be for Canada
exactly
on these certain decisions.
Is it worth risking NAFTA to go for a 2020 Security Council seat to vote this way and step further away from the U.S.? Personally, I don't think so. But anyways. All right, we're going to move into our regional coverage now, and what do you got for BC?
So in BC, I'm going to go very, very local on this, and just down the road from where I'm recording this right now, we're going to start in the city of Victoria, and they plan to ban businesses from offering plastic bags to consumers starting July 1st, 2018. Now, Victoria councillors have approved a bylaw which prohibits grocery stores from offering or selling plastic bags to shoppers. Stores can still offer paper bags or reusable bags for a cost if customers ask. Now, just a little bit of background on the city of Victoria, since people who don't live here might not actually know, well, even some that do live here might not know that Victoria itself is divided up into 14 different municipalities all across the Lower Island here. So the city of Victoria is literally basically just the downtown core of 80,000 people, rather than the 370,000 that the Greater Victoria, all of the municipalities together, combined. So this is just for the city of Victoria, and this is just a municipal bylaw. However, it's kind of indicative of where the city has been going since the election of Mayor Lisa Helps in 2014. Now, Victoria's been mulling around this idea of banning single-use plastic bags for quite a while as part of a wider spread initiative to make Victoria into a greener, more environmentally friendly city. Now, this includes things like dedicated bus lanes right down the main street called Douglas Street, right from the Inner Harbor all the way down. And it also includes taking out lanes for traffic to make into dedicated bike lanes through the more congested parts of downtown Victoria. And from the City of Victoria's website, the draft bylaw proposes that businesses may provide a checkout bag to customers only if the customers first ask whether they need a bag, if the business provides a paper or reusable bag, and if a fee no less than 12 cents for paper bag and minimum $2 per reusable bag is charged.
No
So they're not
less
setting
and minimum.
maximums; they're setting minimums. How much they can be charged here? I just want to point that out. That's the minimum you can be
I
charged
think you
for
should
it.
read that bullet point again.
Yeah, a fee no less than 12 cents per paper bag and a minimum $2 per reusable bag is charged. That's quite a bit of money. So on their website, the city says part of the reason for the ban on plastic bags is that, quote, 17 million plastic bags are used every year by Victoria residents alone, many of which end up in our landfill, local waterways, and on our beaches. Plastics make up over 15% of all landfill waste, comprised of single-use plastic bags, plastic film, and packaging waste. Plastic bags have negative impacts on marine life, the environment, and are made using non-renewable fossil fuels. So that's a direct quote from the City of Victoria website, outlining their reasons for banning these plastic bags. Now let's get down to the penalties here. What's going to happen if they don't comply? Now, businesses could be fined for providing customers a bag without asking if they want one, or for providing a bag free of charge. Now, fines could range between $100 and $10,000 for corporate offenders, and between $50 and $500 for individuals for every offense. Enforcement is not set to begin until 2019, and retailers will still be allowed to use their existing bag stop up to January 2019 without penalty. Now, there are exemptions to this bylaw, including using bags to package loose bulk items such as fruit, vegetables, nuts, grains, or candy, such as you would find in the bulk areas of your supermarket. Could also include small hardware items or to contain or wrap frozen foods, meats, poultry, or fish, to wrap flowers or potted plants, to protect prepared foods or bakery goods, prescription drugs to transport live fish, and to protect linens, bedding, or other large items that cannot easily fit into a reusable bag, or to protect newspapers or clothes after laundering or dry cleaning. So those are the only ways, the only exemptions that you can use plastic bags for now. So now that we've gone into that, let's take a look at the other side. Craig Foster, who's a sustainability consultant for the Canadian Plastics Industry Association, said that Victoria Council is making a huge mistake and ignoring science with the bag ban. He says that producing paper bags and reusable plastic woven bags actually creates more greenhouse gas than the plastic bags that are being banned. He said that Victoria's decision might look good or feel good, but the science isn't there to back it up. And he said, quote, I really think they are going down the wrong path. It's not good policy, and from an environmental perspective, it's a negative. There's no question. Now, in my opinion, I think that other than an outright ban, the best way to get rid of these and to get rid of all the waste for them would be to have a 5-cent deposit fee, similar to aluminum cans. And that could be refunded when you return the bags to a recycling center. Now, years ago, there used to be tons of cans on the sides of roads, especially logging, rural, or other little used roads. Nowadays, you hardly see any, just because the people going out there on their walks to go pick them up and to turn them in for the deposit fee. So if it works for cans, why don't we use it for the plastic bags?
That's a very good point. And another thing that could be done is, instead of focusing in on just banning the bags outright, encourage people to reuse bags, because I know here there is a closet of bags that you get from whenever you go out. You just put them in the closet and you use them when you need to transport something somewhere else. It's very rare that a plastic bag gets thrown out unless it's actually ripped. And another thing that is being sorely neglected by this story is that there are technologies coming into place that can actually create a degradable form of plastic that will degrade down over a much shorter time period than old plastics do. And if there was a renewed emphasis on using these kind of plastics rather than just running away from plastics as a whole, imagine the innovation that could go into that kind of plastic innovation to make biodegradable plastics the mainstream side of the plastic bag industry. Because if those were used instead of regular plastics, I think the issue would largely go away. Though I think the fact that the bags are made using fossil fuels and non-renewables would still upset some people, and I don't know if that would be enough for those in Victoria or elsewhere in the country who want to go completely plastic free. But
yeah, and that's true. And there's something else here is that the cities of Victoria is going to be spending a good portion of money on education and advertising campaigns for this. I believe the number was anywhere up to $100,000 that they're going to be spending just on trying to get rid of this. So it's not like this is going to be something that they're just going to put into law and then put out there and then have it be incumbent on everyone to follow the law. They're actually going to, be trying to do a kind of a re-education campaign for this as well. So that's not going to be cheap either, especially considering they have to do it for the entire city of Victoria. Now, how is this going to work when it comes to the other municipalities? If say we've got one store, say a grocery store that has a location in the city of Victoria, and then they've got another location outside, say in the Saanich municipality or the Langford municipality. How is that going to work? Is one store going to be able to use them, and is the other store not? I think it's going to be difficult to see how they're actually going to implement this and to enforce it as well.
Yeah. And I mean, when it comes down to it, this is going to be a real shock for anyone coming to visit, because I know there are people who are not going to want to pay for a bag, let alone a paper bag at that. And what's the price here? We said 15 cents or 12 cents a paper bag. Yeah,
at least 12 cents per paper bag.
That's pretty steep, because there are places here in Alberta that charge 5 cents for a plastic bag, and even that's a hard ask for many people. And maybe it just might be a little bit different, but 12 cents for a paper bag,
especially when the paper bag actually costs more in greenhouse gases to prepare than the plastic bag does to begin with. And I think that the minimum of 12 cents that they're putting on it is more than it needs to be to begin with. Now, a lot of places around here are already charging 5 cents per plastic bag, and that's what they're using to encourage people to buy their more overpriced $2 or more reusable bags, which again cost more in greenhouse gases to produce than the plastic bags do. So I think really what it comes down to is an education campaign where people need to learn not to throw these things away without using them a bunch of times, and to make sure that they get reused or recycled, because there's lots of programs in grocery stores to take back your plastic bags and then put them in a recycling bag or something like that. And I'm not sure if this is entirely necessary, and I think it's probably going to cause a lot more headaches and a lot more money than it needs to. And how is this going to work with the police? Are they going to be chasing down people with plastic bags now? Is there going to be a drive? Is there going to be a car chase where there's going to be plastic bags flying out of the window, like it was with the old time movies with the bank robbers and the money flying out of the window? I mean, it's just going to tie up more money in police resources, which again is going to cost the city more money, and basically all that money goes back onto the taxpayers. And I'm not sure about where everyone else lives, but the city of Victoria charges a heck of a lot of tax for people that live there or have property there. And it's one of the most expensive cities to live in just because of the taxes. So that's another thing to put in here with this story, I believe. And uh, that's something that not a lot of the media here has been taking note of as well.
Indeed. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's better to reuse and focus on education campaigns for this. But this, these prices were just outright astounding. But I think we could talk more about astounding prices here in our next story coming from Alberta. And that is that the Alberta government has authorized themselves to move up to $37 billion in borrowing. So this past Thursday, the Alberta government issued an order in council that enables up to $37 billion in borrowing. Now, an order in council is basically an order that the government gives itself that doesn't require it's to move through the legislature, and it can just take effect. It is in effect once signed an order given by the lieutenant governor of Alberta, and it just is something that enables, in most cases, money to flow or the government to do things that they weren't able to do beforehand. It's a lot like an executive order. Now, the Alberta government says that the order simply gives the authority to the borrowing plans running through the end of the 2019-2020 fiscal year. Now, in comparison, the 2017-2018 budget only projected up to $32 billion in borrowing. And the government says that it is giving itself room to borrow the extra $5 billion as a fiscal cushion. Those are the exact words used by the government. Finance Minister Joe Ceci didn't make himself available for an interview on Friday regarding this, but in a statement he called the move prudent. He said that we are establishing a $5 billion reserve to ensure that there's cash on hand to protect public services against unexpected costs, major natural disasters, or global credit crunch, such as the one set off by the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis in 2007. And basically, this is expanding the amount of money that Alberta will be able to go into debt by the year 2019-2020. And, it's interesting that we need to add a $5 billion fiscal cushion to the borrowing plan at all if the budget is going in a positive direction, as we heard in this past fall's fiscal update. And what's even more interesting is that this was made just before the Christmas break. It was made on Thursday afternoon, and it really didn't get much coverage in the TV media at the time. And there was, a little bit of coverage in this, like in papers such as the Calgary Sun and the Calgary Herald. But beyond that, there really wasn't much talk about this at all in the media. And, as we talked about in the past with the Omar Khadr story, this is what you do when you're attempting to get out a news item and have it not covered by the media. Because no matter which way you slice it, $5 billion is a huge amount for a province like Alberta when our current borrowing limit was $32 billion and we're going up to an additional $5 billion out of that. If you do some quick math, that's a 15% increase because our initial borrowing limit was $32 billion and we're increasing it by $5 billion. That's 15% more that we can borrow and go into debt, made actionable by a simple signature of the finance minister. And it's not being talked about anywhere in the media. And you have to keep in mind that it was 2004 through the Alison Redford years where Alberta was completely debt-free, and now we're just packing on the debt. Government borrowing is set to hit $71.1 billion in total, the amount borrowed, by 2019-2020. That's $71 billion in total, meaning that the government can borrow upwards of $37 billion in the 2019-2020 fiscal year. And another thing that wasn't mentioned with this is that the government is also removing its limits on purchasing foreign currency for short-term borrowing. And basically what this means is that if the government sees a foreign currency that has gone down and has the potential to go up, they can purchase a good amount of that foreign currency to make money on it and then use the amount of money that they gain from that for other capital projects in the government. And when you think of it this way, this is basically the government playing the stock market to pay off its bills. And you have to ask yourself, in what kind of world would that kind of fiscal management be viable for a household or an individual? It's not. And that's what this government has resorted to here for keeping its coffers afloat. And of course, this move was also criticized heavily by the UCP opposition and Jason Kenney, but there, as we mentioned, there really wasn't much coverage of it at all in the mainstream media. So a huge announcement for the Treasury in Alberta, but not much coverage at the end of the day on this.
Yeah, and having it released right before Christmas break, it's basically the classic move to get it to not be covered in the media. But of course, we do our podcast on Saturday, so everything that gets released at the end of the week gets covered by us if it is most important. So of course, that's why we're talking about it now, right?
Yeah, and I mean, just consider the magnitude here. If you have a budget in your household and you increase that budget by 15%, that's a lot for a household, isn't it? A 15% increase on your budget.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're spending only $1,000 per month on certain things, 15% increase is $150. That can go a long ways to a lot of different things, can it? That's quite a bit of food. That's an extra trip to the grocery store. That's a couple extra movies per week if you're renting it, or if you're that goes a long ways. And so 15% for an entire
15% on 32 billion.
That's quite a bit.
That's huge. So big issue, should have been talked about more, and it's just digging that hole even deeper to the tune of $71 billion. So we'll have to see what the spring fiscal update looks like, if it says rosy or as the fall one was, or if it is a little bit worse. But that will also be telling, given this move was taken in December. So we'll just have to watch that and see. All right, we're going to move on to our firing line segment now, and this is something we've talked about a lot before here on the right side, and we finally have a little bit of a resolution to it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's been almost an entire year since this was first brought up by opposition in the House of Commons, and this was a ruling that the Ethics Commissioner Mary Dawson finally made, and it was a landmark ruling that Justin Trudeau broke multiple federal ethics rules and violated the Conflict of Interest Act when he accepted a ride on the Aga Khan's private helicopter and stayed on his private island over the holidays in 2016. Now, of course, a bit of background, as always, the Conflict of Interest Act was one of the first pieces of legislation passed by Stephen Harper's minority government in late 2006, and Mary Dawson was appointed as the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner shortly after that, and her term as the Ethics Commissioner after multiple extensions is concluded finally on January 8th. So essentially, the ruling boils down to two core issues: whether Trudeau's acceptance of the trip put him in a conflict of interest because the Aga Khan has ongoing business ties with the government, and also whether he broke the rules around when cabinet officials and members of the House of Commons can accept rides on private transportation. So on the first matter, Dawson ruled that Trudeau did not violate Section 14 of the Conflict of Interest Act because he did not discuss official government business with the Aga Khan on the trip. However, she ruled that he did violate Section 11 because the trip could be reasonably inferred as having given influence towards the Aga Khan's interests, which, makes sense because he's going to his private island for free and, having accepted his hospitality. So that's a lot of influence that's going back and forth there.
It may not be intended, but it implied. It's the reverse of lying by omission that we talked about on last week's podcast.
Exactly. So on the second matter, Dawson ruled that Trudeau also broke the rules around when government officials can use private transportation, and noted that he did not clear the use of the Aga Khan's private helicopter with their office as he was required to under Section 12 of the Act. And the only cases where that is allowed is if the individual traveling has either secured permission in advance from the Ethics Commissioner to use the private transportation, or if there are emergency circumstances expenses related to their official duties. So it's very interesting to note that he did not disclose that with her beforehand, because that is what he was parroting in the House of Commons month after month after month, that they are happy to work with the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. That's the only answer that we heard for quite a long time there. Now, Dawson also ruled that Trudeau failed to recuse himself on 2 occasions in May 2016 when there were official discussions of a $15 million endowment by the Canadian government to be made to the Global Centre for Pluralism, which is an institution directly related to Aga Khan and his foundation. She found that Trudeau did not arrange his private affairs in a way that avoided a conflict of interest. And despite the use of the private island and the helicopter, that trip cost taxpayers roughly $200,000. And let me repeat that was a trip that took only just about a week long. So they burned through $200,000 in a week, which is quite something. And it's also 70% more than what was reported to the Ethics Commissioner's office. So he even misrepresented how much the trip had cost.
Gotta wonder what they're
Now,
doing and how they're traveling on a trip that costs that much.
exactly. Must be flying around the world on that amount. Now, Trudeau, of course, he had to do some damage control, so he came out and apologized in a press conference shortly after the reports released and said that he should have cleared the vacation with Dawson in advance and that he takes, quote, full responsibility for the issue. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't, and in future I will be clearing all my family vacations," Trudeau said. And he also repeated past assertions that he considers the Aga Khan a close family friend and a, quote, friend of Canada. And when pressed on how he did not see the vacation as a potential conflict of interest, Trudeau said that he made a mistake. On this issue of a family vacation with a personal friend, it wasn't considered that there would be an issue there, he said. Obviously, there was a mistake. And Trudeau stressed that he plans to be proactive in the future and that he understands that the office of Prime Minister needs to be beyond reproach, which at this point I think is a bit broken after,
Yeah.
since he's being,
And one would think
that he broke the act.
And one would think going in to become prime minister that should be clear from the very beginning.
Exactly, right? And in all those quotes there, I do also have to mention that it seems like the journalists writing these articles kind of cleared up his quotes a little bit, because on the Global News page where this is from, which the link you can find in the show notes, of course, there's a video down below where he was asked by a reporter basically, how did you not know that this would be a possible conflict of interest? And Trudeau basically stumbled over his words using his, traditional ums and ers and ahs before he was able to actually say the sentence that he was going to do. Now, being the prime minister and having as much of a communication problem to answer a simple question on the issue, it really raises a lot of eyebrows as well. And it's only a 40-second video, and he really doesn't say much in it, which is it's really quite something. Now, a bit of background on the Aga Khan. He is basically the religious leader for a sect of Shia Islam, and it's very interesting because he's basically considered royalty, but unlike other royals, he's not ruling over a specific geographic land. Rather, he's ruling over basically a religion. So he's kind of like the Pope in a sense, where except the Pope, of course, rules over Vatican City, of course. So in that sense, in Islam, he's kind of that figure. Now, he has lots of foundations as well, and a lot of them are doing lots of projects in a lot of places around the world. And his foundation has received hundreds of millions of dollars in federal grants from the Canadian government to support its foreign aid work over the years. Dawson actually notes in her report that the Canadian government has contributed nearly $330 million to projects run by the Aga Khan Foundation in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tanzania, and Bangladesh since 1981. She wrote, quote, "The Government of Canada also regularly consults representatives of the Foundation on current and emerging development trends and priorities, such as conflicts in the Middle East." And she also revealed that the December 2016 trip was not the first time that Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, who of course is the wife of Justin Trudeau, that was not the first time that she had visited the island that year. In February 2016, Miss Gregoire Trudeau reached out to the Aga Khan's daughter and discussed the possibility of her vacationing on the island during the month of March. And on March 11th, 2016, Mrs. Trudeau and a friend of hers and their children arrived on the island for a week-long trip. So this is not a new thing either, because then she contacted the daughter again in July of 2016 to ask whether the whole family could come down to spend Christmas on the private island, and that during their trip between December 26th and January 4th, the family exchanged holiday gifts with the Aga Khan and his family. So Dawson writes, quote, by deciding that he or his family should vacation on the Aga Khan's private island during that time, when it was foreseeable prior to both vacations that he and the Aga Khan would continue to have official dealings, Mr. Trudeau failed to arrange his private affairs in a manner that would prevent him from being placed in a conflict of interest. Neither Mr. Trudeau nor his family should have vacationed on the Aga Khan's private island. Now, while finding a violation of the ethics rules does not carry any substantive financial penalty, the maximum fine is just $500, which of course is the amount that Bill Morneau was fined after having broken ethics laws as well. It could also carry heavy reputational baggage for the government as it tries to shake off the criticisms of arrogance and unethical behavior that the Conservatives have been aiming at them for the last several months over the investigation. Now, Andrew Scheer, right after this ruling, also slammed Trudeau, who he's basically and Trudeau's been hounded by the opposition in the House of Commons for almost a year over this vacation. Now, Scheer wrote on his Twitter saying, quote, throughout this process, Trudeau has not acted like someone who accepts he has made a mistake. It seems he believes the rules do not apply to people like him. And it's also interesting, as a little bit of a follow-up to a couple weeks ago, near the end of this Global News article, it's also noted that Mary Dawson has also launched a preliminary inquiry into guess who, none other than Kent Hare, who is the Minister of Sport and Persons with Disabilities, over allegations that he used parliamentary resources to bolster the campaign of his father when he was running for a seat on the Calgary Board of Education. So it seems like this, like the ethics commissioner sure has her work laid out for her.
It's at least 3 cases by my count, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And her term is up on the January 8th. So she's got a little bit to work on over this Christmas break before Parliament resumes and her spot is filled again. So we're going to have to see how this turns out, and to see whether the penalties in reputation will affect the government and their public opinion.
You know, at the end of this, there was the piece about Kent Hare, and that is something that was largely glossed over by in most of the coverage on this. So that's also really big as well, because he is a minister, and that is an issue that isn't going away, because this one's just getting started. And Bill Morneau, you know, isn't anywhere near the conclusion of his investigation as well. So this is going to keep going on and on for a while. And with these kind of things, I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibility that you could see more come out with the Trudeau investigation as well. And one final note on this that, you know, was just really baffling on this is that it seemed to me that the media and Trudeau actually himself was attempting to shift the blame on the first trip to his wife, and then on the success of that first trip, that's how they ended up taking the trip over Christmas last year. So it's almost, it doesn't seem right that they're shifting the blame to his wife, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think maybe his wife has more of a connection with the Aga Khan's daughter, and that's how they got that through. But I think that the government is trying to use that connection as a way of excusing the behavior on Justin Trudeau's part. Now, I don't think that's completely right, as anybody who knows, people in a relationship generally talk to each other about what they're going to do on a vacation or where they're going to go. So
That's
there's no
right.
doubt in my mind that
That's
he
right.
knew exactly what was going
Yeah.
on, and that there's no way that they should be excusing this because of that connection between his wife and the Aga Khan's daughter.
Well, I mean, it could be a relationship like Pierre and Margaret had. You don't know.
Who knows? I mean, we wouldn't know, but the way that they're carrying themselves in public sure suggests something else. And I don't think that's something that the news media should be trying to excuse away
Definitely.
because of that
Yeah.
relationship. And that's something that a lot of the articles that we've been reading on this issue have been trying to do.
All right, folks. Well, there's our firing line. We're going to move on to word of the week right now. We do have something that is actually fitting for this week's episode, and that word is borrow. And that is defined as a verb to take and use something that belongs to someone else with the intention of returning it. Example being, he had borrowed a car from one of his colleagues. And another one, she was wearing a borrowed jacket. Now, obviously, this refers primarily to the Alberta story and the huge amount of borrowing that Alberta is doing, and the fact that we are borrowing it, but it's going to be many, many years before we return what we borrowed. And I think we could probably also extend borrowing to the plastic bag story, and maybe even the vacation in the Bahamas story as well.
Yeah, especially how Trudeau was borrowing private transportation, right?
Exactly. Or how you borrow plastic bags, and you're going to need to be doing more of that if you're in Victoria going forward, providing you don't get caught doing that. So there's our word of the week, borrow. That pretty much concludes this episode of The Right Side. If you want full show notes, you can find that at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on iTunes and YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes and rightsidenews.ca/YouTube. And we're also on Twitter and Facebook at rightsideca. And with that being said, we'll be back next week for a 2017 in review episode where we talk about a good number of topics pertaining to what we covered in 2017. And oh boy, that's going to be a really interesting episode to listen to. But before that, just want to say Merry Christmas to everyone listening, as this episode will be released on Christmas Eve. Have fun, be safe, enjoy the time with your families, everyone.
Indeed, and we will be back next week, of course, with that special show for you, and I hope you guys all enjoy it. Shane and I have both put a lot of time and work into this show, but I believe that you listeners have also done the same, sticking with us over the course of the time that you've been listening, and I hope that next week's episode will be a bit of a reward for that. And with that, I will echo Shane and say Merry Christmas to all of our listeners, and have a safe and fun holiday season wherever you may be in the world, and we will see you again next week, and then we'll be back with the regular shows in the start of January. So with that, we will see you next week, and have a good time, everyone.